Railways are part of the fabric of London, and love them or hate them, without them, the city couldn't function. And it certainly wouldn't have grown to the size it is today. London's sometimes troubled relationship with the train began more than 150 years ago. I've come to the Kew Bridge Steam Museum to find out how the railways came to London. This lovely little loco was originally built to shift slate round a quarry in Wales, but she's just like all the locomotives that took coal from barges on the Thames up to boiler houses inland. And basically she's the younger sister of the big steam locomotives that brought trains into London from north, south, east and west, smashing down slums and causing new suburbs to be built. Now, Phil, how's she going?
Not so bad, thank you very much.
Good. Will she ride with me on board?
Oh yeah, I think we can.
Go on, let's go.
Right.
The world's first ever steam locomotive was built by the brilliant Cornish mining engineer Richard Trevithick in South Wales. This was 1804 and it pulled 10 tons of pig iron from the Penydarren Iron Works down to the bay at Abercynon. Now, tell me how Trevithick brought the steam loco to London.
Well, obviously with 1804 and the Penydarren tramway worked so well, he decided that he would broaden his horizons and came up to London with his roundabout railway called Catch Me If You Can Railway.
So this was a sort of fairground ride?
Fairground ride, charged a penny, but unfortunately it wasn't financially successful.
Trevithick's circular railway at Euston Square ran for only 2 months. It had one major problem. The weight of the 8-ton engine kept cracking the rail.
Trevithick broke all the rails?
Yes, because of the heavy weight of the engine, they were using wood and iron rails. The engine was breaking the rails on the joint.
Trevithick's rails were made of brittle cast iron, and it wasn't until George Stephenson came up with a wrought iron alternative that the railway age really arrived.
Thanks very much indeed. Great ride. The first railway built specially for passengers ran from Liverpool to Manchester and opened in 1830. The line was surveyed and built by George Stephenson, and the locomotive, Rocket, brilliant leading-edge technology, was built by his son, Robert. Now, the first railway didn't come to London for another 6 years after that, and when it did come, it had to come in by a rather unusual route. Now, building a railway line from the country into London obviously wasn't going to be easy, particularly when they had to come through built-up areas like this. The first railway line to be built came from Greenwich and was finished in 1836, and they avoided the problem of having to plough through all these houses and businesses by leapfrogging the roads and doing the whole thing at roof level. Look at this, on a viaduct, no fewer than 878 arches. Now, there were some advantages to this. It meant they had to buy less land than if they'd done it at ground level. But there was a problem too, because the hundreds of navvies who built this thing used so many bricks every day that they caused a nationwide brick shortage. Isn't it wonderful? The venture was financially risky, and the company was obviously worried about losing money because they hedged their bets in every way they could think of. As well as the railway up there, they also built a footpath, and they charged pedestrians for the privilege of walking along beside the tracks. They even tried to sell off the arches themselves for housing, but it never did catch on. I guess it might have been a tad noisy living actually underneath a railway line.
Nearly 170 years later, the viaduct is still in use. Trains run all the way to Dover now. Even though it was expensive, the train service itself still proved popular. Surprisingly though, the idea of commuter lines didn't immediately take off. All the next railways into London were not intended for commuters at all, but for freight. And they were more often than not promoted by businessmen from other parts of the country who wanted to get their goods to markets in London.
During the 1820s and 30s, Birmingham businessmen were sending 1,000 tons of goods to London every week by canal, and they thought probably they ought to have a railway. So they consulted the great George Stephenson, and he said, "I suggest you employ my son Robert to build it." So they did, and he built the Birmingham-London Railway. It was a colossal job. He employed 20,000 men, and it took them almost 5 years. And one of the biggest engineering feats on the whole line was this cutting here. This is Chalk Farm. And it may not look very deep, it's maybe 15, 20 feet, but the fact is this goes for 30 miles all the way to Tring. Now they had to do it just with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows. There were no bulldozers or anything, it was pure manual labour by the navvies. And it said that it took as much manual labour to dig this cutting as to build one of the great pyramids of Egypt. Amazing.
The terminus of the new railway line was at Euston. The Victorians built elaborate and imposing stations in order to reassure their passengers that rail travel was safe. This neoclassical arch stood until the 1960s, when developers levelled it when they redesigned the station on what they thought were more practical lines. These gatehouses are all that remain. Rumour has it that the arch itself is at the bottom of the Lee River. Not all Victorian railway stations were destroyed, some still survive, like this gem, St Pancras.
The Victorians loved building huge, great railway stations with massive engine sheds, and this is St Pancras, from the great Victorian building at the end to this huge arch here. They really liked showing off. And now it's a building site because Eurostar is going to come here, and the Eurostar trains are 400 metres long, so they've had to extend it all the way to there, double the length of the engine sheds. It's going to be fantastic, and you'll be able to go direct from here to Paris in 2¼ hours. All I need is a ticket. To find out how this vast building site works, I've come to meet the contract manager, Ailey McAdam. Ailey, how many chaps have you got working here?
About 850 at the moment.
Wow. Who built this building in the first place?
William Barlow, he was the designer, and he also supervised the construction. Tremendous achievement. At its time, this was the largest single arch building in the world.
Now, surely the roof's always been black corrugated iron, hasn't it?
No, what you see there is a temporary cover.
So what was there before?
Ridge and furrow, which is like valley
glass.
trough, glass. And we're returning it back to its former glory, so to speak.
You're putting in glass again?
That's right. We have light streaming down into the shed, making this whole building feel completely different than it does at the moment.
Well, I think that's absolutely fantastic. Can we go and have a look downstairs?
Let's go.
Right. So now we're down underneath the platforms, right? The trains are coming up there.
That's right.
And this is underground.
Yes.
And this is still Victorian.
Yeah, this is what we call the undercroft, which was created because when Barlow was looking at building St Pancras Station, he decided to come in over the canal rather than under the canal. Our next door station, King's Cross, comes under the canal, and the platform's there at a ground level.
Right.
Because he came in over the canal, he had to elevate the platforms at the first floor, creating this huge void underneath, which is a massive basement.
Yes.
Which he actually used it as beer storage.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the big reasons for creating St Pancras was the Midlands at the time were booming, coal and beer, and he wanted to be the main outlet for the whole of London. So he used this area as storing beer.
This would be full of barrels then?
Full of barrels. An interesting fact is that the distance between these columns is exactly 3 beer barrel lengths. That was one of his design specifications.
Wonderful. So these are original Victorian columns?
They are. They're cast iron columns. They've been here for 150 years.
Now look, I don't want to worry you in any way, but there does seem to be a hole here. Is that deliberate, or have you made a mistake?
Part of our design is to cut a hole in the old train deck slab, and what that will do when light will stream down from the new roof that we're putting on.
Right, so that's all going to be glass?
That's all going to be glass. Stream down through the glass into this area here, and we're reusing this area to house passengers for the international departures, arrivals, passport control, customs, immigration. We're reusing this vast space.
Let's go and have a look upstairs. And this is part of one of the arches holding up the roof, yes?
That's right.
It's enormously high.
It is. Something that Barlow was very keen on. He wanted to make a big mark, a big statement. It's the main line coming into London, and this is their building. So he was very keen to make it higher than King's Cross.
They did like big nuts and bolts, didn't they?
They did, yeah. This is what we call a boot.
Right.
So this ties the arch, which we just talked about, into the cross tie.
Okay.
Which we saw from down below.
Right.
Which keeps the feet of the arch together.
Right.
And then in turn, connects down to the columns.
Right. Right.
To go down deep.
Okay, so they're sitting on the columns in the earth.
That's right.
So tell me about what you actually sit on top of the pillars.
Well, like over here we can see a bearing.
So this is the top of one of those cast iron columns, yes?
Cast iron column is underneath here.
Right.
And this is a bearing we put on top of every...
Just this piece?
That's it.
So the whole of the deck is going to sit on these bearings, and then it will be able to move sideways. Oh, hey, I can move it.
That's right.
So the trains will move it inches, I would think. Well, centimetres in your world.
That's right. So the concrete deck can move independently from the cast and mortar and structure.
That's really cunning.
Yeah.
Anyway, you've only got another week or two on here, haven't you? Well, good luck. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks.
There's also some redevelopment work going on round the front of the station, where the Victorians built that vital part of any railway development, a grand hotel. In 1868, the Midland Railway built their new station at St Pancras. But the building most of us recognise as St Pancras isn't actually the station at all.
In 1873, St Pancras Station was joined by the Midland Grand Hotel next door, built by George Gilbert Scott. Now, the chap who knows about it is Angus Berg. Hello, Angus, who's managing director. Now, I gather that Scott had built only churches and workhouses before this.
Well, that's right. And he entered the competition for the Midland Hotel, and he decided that what he was going to do was this was his last chance to build a grand Gothic revival building. So he poured every last piece of opulence into this building and very nearly busted the Midland Railway in doing it.
Wonderful. And it is ludicrously over the top, isn't it? What are these columns made of?
These are solid marble, and then you see some gold paint above, and you can see the effort that went into the decoration at the high level of these walls.
Right. Now, what were the problems that stopped it being, you know, the grandest hotel in London for the next century?
Well, it was the grandest hotel in London when it opened, but it had certain issues.
Right.
One was that there were only 8 bathrooms.
8 bathrooms?
For 240 bedrooms.
But that means you'd have to queue for an hour.
Well, you have a bath brought to your room by your servants, and this was the other problem, is that social change meant that people didn't travel with their servants.
Right. Now, what's the grandest thing in the whole building?
Well, the grandest thing in the building is the grand stair, and I think we should go and have a look.
Okay, after you.
The grand staircase has more than 800 steps, and the best bit's at the top.
So what were some of the other problems?
There were no lifts, no running water in the rooms, no central heating, and no electricity.
Yes, I guess that would be slightly difficult.
Not all the hotel's guests were well behaved. The Australian cricket team of 1930 were particularly troublesome.
Well, they stayed on the 5th floor, apparently, and used it for net practice when the weather was a bit crossing. They did do a tremendous amount of damage, and were sent a bill for the repairs afterwards.
Good, good.
Just like rock stars.
So this is the top of the grand staircase, and I'm very careful not looking down. It's quite high enough to terrify me. The painting here is quite spectacular, isn't it?
Well, that's right. This is chastity here and temperance over there.
I thought the Australians stayed up here.
Well, I obviously didn't read the signs.
Wonderful, and the whole roof covered with stars.
That's right. And this really is a magnificent piece of painting, and this has been restored fairly recently, as a matter of fact.
You're going to turn this back into a hotel, yes?
That's right. Well, it was a fantastic 5-star hotel, but because of the problems that I mentioned earlier, it closed in 1935, and really, apart from being used very briefly as offices for British Rail, the building's been empty ever since. So after 70 years, we're going to bring it back as a 5-star hotel, probably the best 5-star railway hotel in Europe.
Wonderful. The Midland Railway Company really spent money on this building to make it such an opulent place. And I can't help wondering why. Well, one chap who knows is Roydon Stock. Now, this is a very elegant room, isn't it? Fabulous ceiling.
Yes, a wonderful room, built as the boardroom for the Midland Railway. It overlooks their nearest rival, the Great Northern. And I like to imagine their General Manager, James Joseph Allport, standing up here with a big catapult, trying to smash the windows in. Yes.
But it's funny because that's a really boring building, isn't it? There's no doubt about it.
It's boring but functional, yes.
Yes.
Certainly functional.
Whereas this building is beautiful but
Certainly
dysfunctional.
Exactly,
Yes.
yeah. Bit of a white elephant in its day. and as Scott said himself, almost too good for its own use.
Now, you said they'd be taking out the windows with a catapult. Was there really a lot of rivalry between different companies?
Yes, there was. After the Great Exhibition of 1851, the Midland Railway realised they needed to build their own line into London. So they really wanted to make an impression here. As well as building a station, they wanted to show off. And they wanted to bring in things from the Midlands. This was to be a showcase for the Midlands as well. The bricks on the outside are from Loughborough and Nottingham. The stonework is Ancaster, Ketton. The tiles on the roof were from Leicestershire, mainly. It's all from the Midlands.
Amazing. Not all of London's stations are quite as grand as St Pancras, but the remarkable thing is that the city has so many mainline stations, 12 in all. Landowners and Parliament tried to keep the railways out of the centre of the city, and so we have an arc of stations in North London from east to west, and the big three in the south. Only Charing Cross and Victoria are really in the centre. But all this led to terrible congestion on the roads between all these stations. A solution was desperately needed.
I'm sitting here with Christian Woolmer, who's just written the definitive book about the London Underground. Christian, why did London need an underground?
Well, if you imagine London in the mid-Victorian age, it was a very crowded place. The roads were complete chaos. There were carts, there were horses, carriages, probably something like Calcutta is today. And so they really had to kind of think, what can we do about this?
How did they actually build the line?
Well, the early underground railways were built by cut and cover. They basically dug up the streets, put a railway inside and covered it over again. And that was kind of a pretty crude way of doing it, but it was very effective.
Cut and cover was a messy business. Every time a new line was dug, whole neighbourhoods were thrown into disarray.
Underneath the roads was a mass of cables, pipes, sewers and all sorts of stuff, which they kept digging up. And then they left piles of dirt and tools all over the roads, and eventually people started to complain. The Metropolitan did make some attempt to compensate them, but only in rich areas. Poor people who were thrown out of slums got nothing when the slums were pulled down. Here in posh Bayswater, where they extended the Metropolitan line, they made an attempt to cover up the mess. And if you look here, there's a very elegant row of houses. If you come along this side, suddenly, look, all the windows are fake. They've been painted over. And if you look at the front door here, there's no handle. There's no letterbox. It's concrete. Messenger boys and postmen, young new postmen, have been sent here ever since to play jokes on them, because there's no house here. It's just a front. And behind it, there's nothing but a railway line. Come and have a look. Here we are. Here's the back of that same... look! There's a tube line right underneath. There's no house. In the old days, you see, they had to leave a hole to allow all the smoke and steam to come out. Now they don't need the hole, but there's just a gap between the houses held up by those great girders. It is wonderful.
The advent of electric trains and new tunnelling techniques meant that deep-level tube lines were able to be built. This led to a massive expansion of the underground network in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
What influence did the underground have on the way that London was built?
Wherever it went, if there were green fields there when it was built, within a few years, most of the green fields would be gone, because basically it stimulated the growth of housing. So in a way, the transport system was built before the houses were there. It created a London, as it were.
Railways changed the face of London forever. Not only were new suburbs built, but old areas were knocked down and populations were uprooted.
Here at the Acton Depot, I'm surrounded by ancient trains of every colour and vintage. But I wonder what effect the railways had on the people when they were first built. The head curator at the London Transport Museum is Oliver Green. Oliver, what were the consequences of the building of the railways for the people who lived there?
Well, it would depend who you are, really. The railways were both destroyers and creators in many ways, because they came to London and just knocked through great neighbourhoods of London, usually the poorer neighbourhoods. And obviously for the people there, it meant they lost their homes, they had to move somewhere else, there was no compensation for them. But at the same time, once the railways were established, they were creating jobs, they were bringing more opportunities to London, they were bringing goods to London, passengers to London, and in that sense, they were quite a creative impact. on London.
How were working class people able to take advantage of the railways?
There was the Cheap Trains Act, which tried to force the railway companies to offer cheap transport to working class people who'd been displaced when the railways came into London. And the hope was that these people would be able to move out to Edmonton, Enfield, somewhere like that, and commute into work. Of course, in practice, it was never the same people, and those who were displaced probably they couldn't afford to move out, even at the cheap rates. And again, there is a sort of division between East and West here, because the Great Eastern Railway, who had extended into Liverpool Street from their original terminus at Bishopsgate, part of the price of doing that was they had to offer cheap fares.
Oh, I see. Okay, right.
And they actually set about that with quite some relish, and that's remained to this day. That if you go, Liverpool Street is still one of the busiest stations. There are a huge number of trains coming in at rapid intervals, coming in from the northeastern suburbs, which from that day onwards, and still to this day, are much more in the way of working class suburbs of London, and of course the whole of East London is to some extent. It's probably no exaggeration to say that the railways have done more to shape London than anything else. It's something everybody uses, and there's no other city that has that kind of link-in with I mean, railways are the complete lifeblood of the city. They were in the 19th century, and they are today.
Railways may seem endlessly frustrating to the modern commuter, but slowly improvements are being made to the ageing infrastructure of the original railway city.
With the world's first overground and underground rail networks, railways have always had an important effect on the development of the city. And because there are always extensions in the pipeline, that's going to go on into the future. And that means that Londoners can move away from the centre and still remain within easy reach of their workstations.